Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a world at the edge of the Imperium where the ground itself breathes fire, where mountains split open like wounds in the earth, and rivers of molten stone carve through valleys older than human memory, where the sky burns orange at dusk, and the air tastes of sulfur and ash, and something ancient that has no name. This is Nocturne. And from its burning heart came a being unlike any other in the long and terrible history of mankind's war among the stars. His name is Vulkan. And before we speak of him, before we trace the path of his legend from the cradle of fire to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, you need to understand something. In a universe of 20 demigod suns created by the Emperor of mankind, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and warpcraft, designed to embody some facet of humanity's potential, Vulkan stands apart. Not because he was the fastest, not because he was the most cunning or the most politically savvy, or the most psychically gifted. Vulkan stands apart because he was the strongest, the single most physically powerful being the Emperor ever created outside of himself. A creature of such raw, earth-shaking might that in sparring matches with his brothers, he had to hold back for fear of genuinely hurting them. A Primarch who could lift battle tanks with his bare hands and hurl them through the air like toys. A warrior whose weapons were so massive, so impossibly heavy, that even a fully armored space marine in Terminator plate could not hope to lift them from the ground. But strength alone does not make a legend. If it did, Vulkan's story would be a simple one, a chronicle of battles won and enemies broken. And that is not the tale that history has left us. Because Vulkan was something else, something that should not have been possible in the grim darkness of the far future. He was kind, he was compassionate, he cared genuinely and deeply. It's about the people he was built to protect. In a galaxy that runs on suffering and where mercy is treated as weakness, Vulkan chose over and over again to be human. And it is that choice, more than any feat of raw power, that makes his story one worth telling. So settle in, breathe deep, let the fire crackle and the embers drift upward into the dark. We have a long way to travel together, from the volcanic cradles of Nocturne to the shattered fields of Istvan, from the torture chambers of the Night Haunter to the golden heart of terror itself. This is the story of the Lord of Drakes, the Hammer of Salvation, the Promethean fire, the Primarch who could not die and whose flame may yet burn again. This is the story of Vulkan. To understand Vulkan, you first have to understand the place that made him. And Nocturne is not a kind place. It is a death world in the truest sense of the term, and a planet that seems actively hostile to the very concept of life existing upon its surface. Picture it for a moment. A world of black volcanic stone and jagged mountain ranges that stretch toward a sky perpetually smeared with ash. A planet whose surface is dominated by thousands of active volcanoes, any one of which could erupt without warning and swallow entire settlements in rivers of liquid rock. The oceans boil near the volcanic vents, and the atmosphere is thick with particulate matter that turns every sunset into a smear of bruised orange and angry red. But the true horror of Nocturne lies not in its volcanoes alone. It lies in its moon. Nocturne's moon, Prometheus, orbits the planet in an erratic, elliptical path. Every 15 Terran years, Prometheus swings close enough to its parent world that the gravitational stress becomes catastrophic. The Nocturnians call this event the time of trial, and the name is not an exaggeration. During the time of trial, the tectonic plates of the planet buckle and shift under the increased gravitational pull. Every volcano on the surface erupts simultaneously. The seas rise in vast tidal waves that crash across the lowlands. Earthquakes shatter cities. The ground itself cracks open and swallows entire communities whole. The sky fills with so much ash and debris that day becomes indistinguishable from night, and the temperature swings wildly between scorching heat near the eruptions and bitter cold in the ash-darkened regions. The people of Nocturne endure this, not once, not occasionally, Every 15 years, like clockwork, their entire world tries to kill them. And they survive. They rebuild. They endure. They light their forges again and hammer new tools from the cooling stone. They bury their dead and raise their children and tell their stories and wait for the next time of trial to come around again, because that is what the people of Nocturne do. They are, by necessity, among the hardiest and most resilient human populations in the entire galaxy. The weak do not survive on Nocturne. The planet does not permit it. But Nocturne is not only a place of destruction. The same volcanic activity that makes the world so dangerous also churns up mineral deposits of extraordinary rarity and value from deep within the planet's core. Metals and ores that the Adeptus Mechanicus would pay fortunes for bubble up through the lava flows and cool in veins of gleaming crystal. This abundance of raw materials, combined with the Nocturnians' cultural emphasis on craftsmanship and self-reliance, and has produced a population of some of the finest metalworkers and smiths in the Imperium. Every settlement on Nocturne has its forge, and every forge has its master, and the art of shaping metal is held in the same reverence that other cultures might reserve for poetry or prayer. It is into this world, during one of its times of trial, that a blazing comet fell from the sky. It struck the earth near the settlement of Hesiod, the largest of Nocturne's 7 sanctuary cities. And when the people dug through the rubble and the cooling rock, they found something impossible. A child, an infant, impossibly large even then, cradled in the remnants of what appeared to be some kind of gestation capsule, alive, unburned, untouched by the fires that should have killed any mortal creature 1,000 times over. A blacksmith named Enbel took the child in. Enbel was what the Nocturnians called a blacksmiter, a master metalworker, and he recognized in this impossible infant something that the ancient teachings of the Promethean cult had long prophesied. A savior, a being of fire and strength who would one day deliver the people of Nocturne from their enemies and lead them into an age of glory. Enbel named the child Vulkan, after the first and most legendary king of the salamanders, and he raised him as his own son. What followed was something that even the most optimistic of the Hesiod elders could not have predicted. For within 3 Terran years, Vulkan had grown to full adulthood. Not merely adult size, mind you. He had grown larger and more muscular than any human being on Nocturne, which is saying something on a world where the people are already extraordinarily robust due to the planet's higher-than-average gravity. But it was not only his size that set him apart. Vulkan was intelligent. Staggeringly, impossibly intelligent. Yet he studied at Enbel's forge, and within months had surpassed his adopted father's skill. Within a year, he was teaching metalworking techniques to the master smiths of Hesiod that they had never seen before, advancing the settlement's technology by centuries in what felt like the blink of an eye. The people of Nocturne had always been skilled craftsmen. Vulkan made them something more. But there was another quality that the young Primarch displayed, or one that perhaps mattered more than his strength or his intellect. Vulkan cared about the people around him. He felt their suffering as his own. When the ground shook and the fires came, he was the first to the barricades, the first to pull survivors from the rubble, the last to leave the burning fields. He did not stand apart from the Nocturnians as a distant god or an aloof superior. He lived among them, and he ate with them and laughed with them and mourned with them when the time of trial claimed their loved ones. He was, in every way that mattered, one of them. And then the dusk wraiths came. The people of Nocturne had a name for the terrors that descended upon their world in the dark of night. They called them dusk wraiths, and they feared them more than the volcanoes, more than the earthquakes, more than the time of trial itself. Because the volcanoes and the earthquakes were natural forces. Terrible, yes. Deadly, certainly, but predictable in their way, and survivable if you were strong enough and smart enough and stubborn enough. The dusk wraiths were something else entirely. In truth, they were Dark Eldar, Drukhari as they named themselves, raiders from the dark city of Komorach, that impossible nightmare realm hidden in the depths of the webway, where pain is currency and suffering is art. They came to Nocturne periodically, swooping down from the sky in their slave barges to snatch up the Nocturnian people and drag them screaming back to Komorragh, where they would be subjected to agonies that the human mind cannot fully comprehend and remain sane. The Drukhari are creatures that feed on suffering. They require pain, the pain of others, to sustain themselves, to stave off the slow consumption of their souls by the dark god Slanesh. And the people of Nocturne are hardy and strong and capable of enduring tremendous physical trauma, made excellent prey. For generations, the Nocturnians had dealt with these raids in the only way they could. They hid. Every person in every settlement had their own hiding place, a bolt hole or a cellar or a crevice in the rock where they would crawl when the dark shapes appeared in the sky. They had learned through bitter experience that fighting the dusk wraiths was futile. The aliens were too fast, too well armed, too cruel to be resisted by ordinary humans with hammers and crude weapons. And so the people of Nocturne did what they had always done. They endured, they hid, they survived, and they mourned those who were taken. Vulkan changed all of that. In his 4th year on Nocturne, when the Dark Eldar came again, Vulkan refused to hide. While the people around him scrambled for their bolt holes and their cellars, as the young Primarch walked out into the center of Hesiod with his 2 smithing hammers crossed over his massive shoulders and stood there, waiting, as the slave barges descended from the ash-choked sky. The people of Hesiod watched in horror from their hiding places, certain that this giant they had come to love was about to throw his life away in a gesture of futile defiance. They were wrong. What followed was less a battle and more a reckoning, where Vulkan waded into the Dark Eldar with a fury that none of them had ever encountered on this backwater world. His hammers, crafted by his own hands in the forge of Inbel, moved with a speed and power that should have been impossible for any mortal being. He smashed their slave barges out of the sky. He crushed their warriors underfoot. Their poisoned blades, which could fell the mightiest human fighters, sparked harmlessly against his granite-like skin. He was immune to their toxins, yet resistant to their weapons, and possessed of a strength and ferocity that the Drukhari, for all their millennia of inflicting terror upon lesser beings, had simply never encountered before. And then something extraordinary happened. The people of Hesiod, watching this impossible being tear through the raiders who had terrorized them for generations, felt something stir inside them. Something that had been beaten down and buried by centuries of helpless victimhood. They stopped hiding. One by one, then in groups, then in a surging tide, they emerged from their bolt holes and their cellars and their crevices in the rock. They picked up their hammers and their tools and their crude weapons, and they fought. With Vulkan at their head, the people of Hesiod did what no Nocturnian community had ever done before. They drove the Dark Eldar from their world. Not merely repelled them, drove them away, scattered them, sent them fleeing back to the poisoned darkness of Komorragh with the taste of their own blood in their mouths and a new and unfamiliar sensation burning in their hollow chests. Fear. Word of this victory spread across Nocturne like wildfire across dry tundra. Within weeks, the headsmen of the 7 most important settlements on the planet had traveled to Hesiod to meet this legendary warrior. They came expecting a warlord, a conqueror, a being of terrible power, who would demand tribute and obedience. What they found instead was a young man, enormous and powerful beyond measure, yes, but also warm and generous, and deeply concerned with the welfare of the common people whose suffering he had ended. Vulkan did not demand their fealty. He did not threaten or coerce. He simply asked them to stop hiding, to stand and fight, to refuse to be victims any longer. And they listened, one by one. The headsmen of the 7 settlements knelt before Vulkan and swore to never again cower from the raiders. In celebration of this moment, a great tournament was called, a festival of contests involving feats of strength endurance, and craftsmanship that was sacred to the people of Nocturne. And it was during this tournament that a stranger arrived. He was pale-skinned and oddly dressed, this outlander, and he came with a quiet confidence that struck the Nocturnians as either admirable or insane. He asked only to be allowed to compete. When the people laughed and asked who could possibly challenge Vulkan, the stranger simply smiled and proposed a wager. Whoever lost the tournament would serve the victor forever. Vulkan accepted. The contest lasted 8 days. 8 days of grueling trials that tested every aspect of physical and mental ability. In the anvil lift, yet both competitors held massive iron anvils above their heads for half a day before the judges called the event a tie. In contests of smithing and endurance and raw strength, neither could claim a decisive victory over the other. By the end of the 8th day, Vulkan and the stranger were perfectly tied. For the final event, both contestants were given 24 hours to forge a weapon, then use that weapon to hunt and slay the largest salamander they could find. The salamanders of Nocturne were not the small lizards of ancient terror. They were massive, heat-resistant reptilian predators, some as large as battle tanks, and the largest of them, the great fire drakes that dwelt in the volcanic peaks, were among the most dangerous creatures on a planet that was itself among the most dangerous in the galaxy. Vulkan forged a huge warhammer. The stranger crafted a keen-edged blade. Both climbed to the summit of Mount Deathfire, the greatest volcano on Nocturne, and where the largest fire drakes were said to lair. Vulkan found his quarry first and slew it with a single devastating blow from his hammer. But as he carried the massive carcass back down the mountainside, the volcano erupted without warning. The ground shook, lava burst from hidden vents, and Vulkan found himself clinging to the edge of a cliff with one hand, his other hand stubbornly gripping the tail of his reptilian prize, while the world crumbled around him. For hours he hung there, and his superhuman strength slowly ebbing as the cliff crumbled beneath his fingers. He knew he had to choose, the drake or his life, the prize or survival, and then the stranger appeared. He was carrying his own drake, and even from the edge of the cliff, Vulkan could see that the outlander's kill was larger. The stranger had won the final contest. The tournament, by all rights, was his. But instead of claiming his victory, the stranger did something that Vulkan did not expect. Something that changed everything. He threw his drake into the river of lava that separated them, used the massive carcass as a bridge to cross to where Vulkan hung, and with hands that were impossibly strong for his relatively slight frame, the stranger hauled the Primarch up from the precipice and set him on solid ground. When they returned to Hesiod, the stranger empty-handed and Vulkan carrying his prize, the people declared Vulkan the victor. He had the larger kill, after all. But the stranger had thrown his away. But to the astonishment of everyone present, Vulkan knelt before the outlander. "Any man who would value life over pride," Vulkan said, "is worthy of my service." The stranger reached down and removed his disguise, and standing before the people of Nocturne, in all his terrible and radiant glory, was the Emperor of mankind. This moment, this single crystallizing instant on the slopes of a volcanic death world at the edge of the galaxy, as tells you everything you need to know about Vulkan. Not about his strength, though his strength was beyond measure. Not about his skill, though his skill was extraordinary. It tells you about his character. In a setting defined by pride and dominance and the ruthless exercise of power, Vulkan chose to kneel, not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, but because he recognized in the stranger's act of self-sacrifice something more valuable than victory, something more precious than pride, humanity. The Emperor had come to Nocturne seeking his lost son as he sought all his scattered children across the stars. He had come in disguise, testing Vulkan not merely as a warrior or a craftsman, but as a being. And Vulkan had passed the test, not by winning, but by recognizing what it truly meant to lose with grace and to honor sacrifice above triumph. From that day forward, Vulkan served the Emperor. But it is worth noting that Vulkan did not immediately take command of his legion, unlike some of his brother Primarchs, who were given control of their space marine forces almost instantly upon discovery. Vulkan spent time with the Emperor first. He studied, he learned, he observed the wider galaxy and the vast machine of the Imperium that his father had built. And when he finally was given command of the 18th Legion, he did not simply take them as they were, he remade them. While the Legion that would become the Salamanders had existed before Vulkan's arrival, of course. Originally known as the Dragon Warriors, they were a relatively small force, perhaps the smallest of all the legions, and they had earned a reputation that was, in those early days, somewhat more bloody and bellicose than the chapter they would later become. The 18th Legion fought hard and died hard, and their ranks were thin. Vulkan looked at these warriors, these sons of his genetic line. Oh, and he saw potential, but he also saw something that needed to change. The Dragon Warriors were effective killers, but they lacked purpose beyond the killing. They lacked the soul that Vulkan believed a legion needed if it was to be more than just a weapon. So he gave them one. He renamed them the Salamanders, after the great fire drakes of Nocturne, whose hunt had brought him to the Emperor's side. He reorganized them into 7 realms, each linked to one of Nocturne's 7 sanctuary cities, whilst binding the Legion to the world and its people in a way that no other Primarch had done with their homeworld. He established the Promethean cult, a set of spiritual and cultural beliefs that drew upon the ancient traditions of Nocturne and codified them into a philosophy that would guide the Salamanders for millennia to come. The Promethean cult is worth dwelling on for a moment, yes, because it is central to understanding who the Salamanders are and why they are different from virtually every other Space Marine chapter in the Imperium. At its core, the Promethean cult teaches 3 things. Self-reliance, because the people of Nocturne know that no one else is coming to save you when the ground opens up beneath your feet. Self-sacrifice, because the survival of the community depends on individuals willing to put themselves in harm's way for the sake of others. And the circle of fire, the belief that in death we are returned to the ash from which we came, to be reborn anew, our blood and bone bonded with the earth. Fire is the central symbol of the Promethean faith. Fire destroys, yes, but fire also creates. It heats the forge where metal is shaped into tools and weapons. It warms the home when the ash clouds blot out the sun. It lights the way in the darkness. Fire is the dual nature of existence itself. Destruction and creation bound together in a single, eternal flame. And the Salamanders, through their rituals and their practices and their deeply held beliefs, have made themselves the living embodiment of that duality. The most visible expression of the Promethean cult among the Salamanders is the practice of honor scarring. Before every battle and after every engagement, a Salamander will have a ritual scar burned into his flesh. These are not random marks. Each scar is a prayer, a vow, or a promise made in fire and sealed in pain. Over the course of a long career, a veteran Salamander will have his entire body covered in these burn scars, each one a testament to a battle fought and survived, a brother lost and mourned, a vow fulfilled or yet to be fulfilled. Only after every other part of the body has been marked will the scarring progress to the face, which is considered the final and most sacred canvas. But the Promethean cult is not merely a set of rituals. It is a way of life, and the core of that way of life, the beating heart of everything the Salamanders are, is the belief that Space Marines exist to protect humanity, not to rule it, not to exploit it, not to look down upon it from armored parapets with cold contempt, to protect it. The Salamanders, alone among the Space Marine chapters of the Imperium, maintain deep and genuine connections with the civilian population of their homeworld. Yes, they live among the people of Nocturne's sanctuary cities. They serve as leaders and guardians and teachers. They know their names. They attend their festivals and their funerals. They are part of the community in a way that would be considered bizarre, even scandalous, by the standards of virtually any other chapter. And this was Vulkan's design. This was his gift to his sons. Not just strength, not just skill, not just the tools and weapons forged in the fires of Nocturne. He gave them a reason to fight that went beyond orders and duty and genetic programming. He gave them love. Love for the people they were created to protect. Love for the world that had forged them. love for each other, not as cogs in a military machine, but as brothers in the truest sense of the word. There is another element of the Promethean cult that deserves attention, and that is the concept of isolation. Not the cold, punishing isolation of exile or imprisonment, but the deliberate, chosen isolation of the smith at his forge. The Promethean cult teaches that only through solitary meditation and self-examination can a warrior truly understand himself and his purpose. Before every campaign, every major engagement, every significant undertaking, a salamander builds his own pyre. He leaves his brothers and walks alone into the wilderness, or into the deepest chambers of the fortress monastery. And he lights his fire, and he sits before it, and he looks into the flames, and he asks himself the questions that matter. Who am I? What do I fight for? Am I worthy of the hammer I carry and the name I bear? This is not weakness. This is not navel-gazing or self-indulgent introspection. This is the discipline of the forge applied to the soul. A blade that is never tested will shatter at the first real blow. A warrior who never examines his own heart will break when the darkness closes in, and there is nothing left but the sound of his own breathing and the weight of everything he has done and everything he has failed to do. The salamanders test themselves constantly, not because they doubt, but because they understand that certainty, true certainty, can only come from confronting uncertainty and choosing your path anyway. And this, too, was Vulkan's gift. He did not simply tell his sons to be brave. He gave them a framework for understanding what bravery meant. He did not simply order them to be compassionate. He built a culture that valued compassion as a virtue equal to martial prowess. He did not simply demand loyalty. He created a community in which loyalty was not a duty imposed from above, but a bond forged in shared experience and mutual sacrifice. The physical characteristics of the salamanders are worth noting here as well. Yes, because they are intimately connected to the world that made them and the Primarch who shaped them. Due to a quirk in their gene seed, the genetic material derived from Vulkan's own DNA that transforms an ordinary human into a space marine, the salamanders have two distinctive physical traits. Their skin is coal black, darker than any natural human complexion, a deep and uniform obsidian that absorbs light and seems to glow faintly in the heat of battle. And their eyes burn with a red, a smouldering fire, as if the volcanic soul of Nocturne itself had been captured and set behind their corneas. These traits are not cosmetic. They are a reflection of the unique reaction between the salamander's gene seed and the radiation-heavy environment of Nocturne, where the constant exposure to the planet's volcanic emissions triggers a genetic response that darkens the skin and alters the melanochromic organ in ways that are unique among the Space Marine chapters. And the result is that the salamanders look like what they are: warriors forged in fire, sons of a volcanic death world, beings who carry the heat of Nocturne's heart within their very flesh. When a salamander walks into a room, you do not need to read his heraldry or check his chapter insignia to know who he is. You can see it in his skin and in his eyes and in the way he carries himself, as the quiet confidence of a being who has been tested by the worst that the universe can throw at him and has come through the other side with his soul intact. Upon the death of a salamander, if the body can be recovered, it is returned to Nocturne and ritually burned in the Imperium, a sacred crematoria located deep within the heart of Mount Deathfire. The Imperium is a place of extraordinary spiritual significance. Yes, a vast cavern of volcanic rock where the bodies of fallen warriors are offered to the sacred fire of the mountain. According to Promethean belief, the essence of the departed is passed on through the flames, bonded with the earth and the fire, becoming part of the eternal cycle. This is not merely a funeral rite. It is a statement of faith, a declaration that death is not the end, but a transformation, a return to the elements from which all things are made. If the body cannot be returned to Nocturne, the fallen salamander's brothers may choose to cremate him locally, building a pyre on whatever battlefield claimed his life and committing his remains to whatever fire is available. The important thing is not the location, but the act itself. the acknowledgement that fire is the medium through which the dead are released from the bonds of flesh and returned to the great cycle of creation and destruction that defines all existence. But the Promethean cult also extends to the way the salamanders recruit and train their aspirants. Young men from Nocturne's sanctuary cities who wish to join the chapter must undergo a series of trials that test not only their physical capabilities, but their character and their connection to the Promethean faith. These trials include walking across beds of burning coals, lifting massive cauldrons of boiling liquid, enduring the searing pain of the proving rod, and bearing red-hot iron bars. The purpose of these trials is not cruelty, though to an outsider they might appear that way. The purpose is to forge, to take raw material and subject it to heat and pressure and force until what emerges is harder and purer and stronger than what went in. The final trial, the one that determines whether an aspirant will be accepted into the chapter, takes place on Mount Deathfire itself. The aspirant must climb to the summit and face the great fire drakes that lair in the volcano's depths. Not to kill one, necessarily, though that would certainly be impressive, but to face one, to stand before a creature of primordial fury and devastating power and not flinch. To look into the eyes of death and choose to remain standing. This is the test, not of strength, not of skill, of will, of the quality that the Promethean cult values above all others. Endurance. This is what set the salamanders apart during the Great Crusade, that vast and terrible war of expansion in which the Emperor's 20 legions swept across the galaxy, bringing world after world into the fold of the Imperium. The Great Crusade was, by any measure, a brutal affair. Entire civilizations were destroyed. Alien species were exterminated. Human populations that had developed independently during the long isolation of the Age of Strife were forced, sometimes at gunpoint, to abandon their cultures and their beliefs and submit to the rule of distant terror. The Great Crusade was necessary, perhaps. It unified humanity at a time when division would have meant extinction. But it was not clean, and it was not merciful, and many of the legions that carried it out did so with a casual disregard for collateral damage that would have horrified their creators if their creators had been the sort of beings who were easily horrified. The salamanders were different. Under Vulkan's command, the 18th Legion developed a reputation for something extraordinary in the context of the Great Crusade. They took care, not always, not perfectly. They were still a military force operating in a galaxy that rewarded aggression and punished hesitation, and there were worlds that burned under their advance just as surely as under any other legions. But when it was possible, when there was a choice to be made between efficiency and compassion, the salamanders chose compassion. They minimized civilian casualties. They went out of their way to evacuate non-combatants from war zones. They rebuilt what they could of the worlds they conquered, instead of simply moving on to the next target. This earned them admiration from some quarters and contempt from others. Their brother legions, many of whom measured success in bodies counted and worlds claimed, often viewed the salamanders' humanitarian tendencies as weakness, or at best, a charming eccentricity. But Vulkan did not care what his brothers thought. He had seen what unchecked brutality did to the soul of a warrior. He had seen it on Nocturne, in the cruelty of the Dark Eldar. He had seen it in the eyes of conquered populations, who looked upon their so-called liberators with the same terror they had felt under their former oppressors. And he had decided, quietly and firmly, and with the absolute conviction that was as much a part of his nature as his strength, that his sons would be better than that. This conviction would be tested, savagely and personally, during the campaign on the world designated 1546, known locally as Karatan. It was here that the salamanders fought alongside the Night Lords, the legion of Vulkan's brother Conrad Kurz, the being known as the Night Haunter. And it was here that Vulkan's belief in the sanctity of human life collided head-on with the Night Lord's philosophy of rule through absolute terror. But the Night Lords did not merely fight the enemy on Karatan. They terrorized the civilian population. They slaughtered the inhabitants of an entire city, not because those inhabitants were hostile, not because they posed any military threat, but because the sight of an entire city's worth of mutilated corpses would frighten the remaining population into submission. It was, by the Night Lord's standards, efficient, effective. The resistance on Karatan collapsed shortly after, was exactly as Kurz had predicted it would. Vulkan was sickened. When he confronted Kurz about what the Night Lords had done, the exchange between the two Primarchs was brief and violent. These were not ordinary men having a disagreement. These were two beings of godlike power whose fundamental worldviews were so diametrically opposed that any extended conversation between them could only end in conflict. Vulkan believed in protecting the innocent. The Kurz believed that innocence was an illusion and that terror was the only honest form of governance. There was no middle ground between these positions. There never would be. Vulkan reported Kurz's conduct to both War Master Horus and to Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, but the response he received was not what he had hoped for. Horus, who by this point in the timeline was already beginning to feel the pull of the dark powers that would eventually consume him, he dismissed Vulkan's concerns with mockery. He thanked Vulkan for making Kurzi into an even more mighty weapon of terror, as if the Primarch of the Salamanders had been complaining about a tool that worked too well rather than an atrocity committed against defenseless civilians. This encounter with Horus troubled Vulkan deeply. He sensed something wrong in the War Master, a darkness, a cold, calculating malice that had not been there before, or that Vulkan had simply been too trusting to notice. And this feeling, this instinct born of a lifetime spent among people whose survival depended on reading the signs of approaching danger, led Vulkan to make a crucial decision. He had been crafting a magnificent weapon, a great warhammer called Dawnbringer, intended as a gift for Horus upon his elevation to the rank of War Master. But now, sensing that darkness within his brother, Vulkan chose not to deliver the gift. He kept Dawnbringer, and more than that, he began to consider the possibility that the weapons he had created, the countless masterworks of devastating technology that filled his vaults on Prometheus, might need to be destroyed rather than risk falling into the wrong hands. This decision, made quietly in the forges of Nocturne without fanfare or announcement, would prove to be one of the most significant moments in the history of the Imperium. Because the wrong hands were already reaching for everything Vulkan held dear. As the Horus heresy was coming, and for Vulkan and his salamanders, it would come with fire and betrayal, and a darkness so profound that it would take the strongest Primarch to his very breaking point. But before we follow Vulkan into that darkness, we need to talk about his strength, because the title of this narrative is not a casual claim or a matter of fan debate. It is a statement of fact, established in the lore by multiple sources, and acknowledged even by his fellow Primarchs. But Vulkan was the strongest. Period. Let us examine what that means. When we talk about the strength of a Primarch, we are already operating in a realm so far beyond normal human comprehension that the words themselves begin to lose meaning. A Primarch is not a human being. A Primarch is a demigod, a creature engineered from the Emperor's own genetic material and infused with warp energy to create something that transcends the boundaries of biology. Each Primarch was a unique masterwork and designed to embody a different aspect of human potential, taken to its absolute extreme. Horus embodied charisma and leadership. Guilliman embodied organization and governance. Sanguinius embodied angelic grace and martial beauty. Magnus embodied psychic power. And Vulkan embodied raw, physical, unbreakable strength. The evidence for this is not ambiguous. Yes, in the Horus Heresy novel collection, Age of Darkness, specifically in the story Forgotten Sons, one of Vulkan's own salamanders describes his Primarch's strength and fortitude as unrivaled among the Primarchs. The passage notes that while Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands may have been comparable in raw physical power, with Ferrus now dead, the point was settled. Vulkan was the strongest, and this observation is not made in a vacuum. It is made while Vulkan is literally running through a battlefield and throwing battle tanks into the air with his bare hands. Let that image sink in for a moment. A Lehman Russ battle tank weighs approximately 60 tons. Vulkan was picking them up and hurling them like a child throwing stones into a pond. But it was not merely his contemporaries who recognized Vulkan's physical supremacy. The Emperor himself, in the design of his sons, seems to have intended Vulkan to be the pinnacle of physical capability. Consider the evidence. Vulkan was consistently described as one of the largest of the Primarchs, rivaled in sheer size only by Magnus the Red, who was a being whose physical form was heavily influenced by his immense psychic power, and thus somewhat anomalous.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to pause here for a second and give you my honest take on this part of the lore. Out of every single story I have covered on this channel, Vulkan's captivity under Curzay is the one that sticks with me the most. And not because of the violence, because there are plenty of grimdark stories that go harder on the shock factor. It sticks with me because of what it says about the two of them. You have Curzay, who's essentially trying to win a philosophical argument by killing his brother over and over, and Vulkan, who keeps coming back and basically says, no, you're wrong, just by existing. That's such a raw concept to me. The idea that simply refusing to change who you are can be the most powerful act of defiance imaginable. I genuinely believe this is some of the best character writings in the entire Horus Heresy. And if you have not read Vulkan Lives, I would really recommend picking it up, just for the Curzay and Vulkan scenes alone. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
In terms of raw musculature and built physicality, Vulkan was the biggest. And on a world like Nocturne, where the gravity was higher than the galactic standard, and the very environment selected for the strongest and most durable specimens, his body had been tempered since infancy into something approaching the theoretical limit of what even a Primarch's frame could achieve. The weapons he carried are themselves a testament to his strength. Dawnbringer, his great warhammer, was so massive that no being short of a Primarch could hope to lift it. And it was described as being made of indestructible materials, and it incorporated a built-in teleporter that allowed Vulkan to traverse vast distances, even between planets. Think about that for a moment. His weapon was not merely a weapon, it was a piece of technology so advanced that it functioned as a personal teleportation device, and it was disguised as a hammer because Vulkan was the kind of being who saw no reason why a tool of war should not also be a tool of travel. And then there was Doom Tremor. Crafted later in his life, during his return to fight the greenskin menace known as the Beast, Doom Tremor was a thunderhammer of such prodigious size that even a fully armored space marine in Terminator plate, a warrior already augmented beyond the limits of normal human strength and wearing a powered exoskeleton that multiplied that strength many times over, could not lift it from the ground. Doom Tremor was a weapon built for one hand in the galaxy, Vulkan's. And then there was Draculae, the most powerful of all his weapons, a massive two-headed warhammer of monstrous power that Vulkan forged in an unconscious state, guided by the psychic hand of the Emperor himself. Draculae was capable of things that should have been impossible. It could shatter the metallic arms of Ferrus Manus, arms that were thought to be completely indestructible, forged in the living metal of a Necron construct. It could inflict permanent death upon a greater demon, and a feat that normally requires extraordinary psychic power or weapons of unique consecration. And it could, as we shall see, banish a demon Primarch with a single devastating blow. But Vulkan's strength was not merely a matter of lifting heavy objects and swinging large weapons. It manifested in his durability, his endurance, and his sheer stubborn refusal to be destroyed. In the lore, Vulkan is described as possessing toughness 7 on the tabletop, and his armor, the Draken Scale, would reduce the strength of any flamer, fusion, volkite, melter, or plasma weapon used against him by half. This meant that standard plasma weapons, which could punch through the armor of a space marine and reduce their flesh to superheated vapor, were functionally useless against Vulkan. He was, for all practical purposes, immune to some of the most devastating anti-infantry weapons in the entire galactic arsenal. And then there was his other gift. There was his pet, the one that truly set him apart from every other Primarch, every other being in the Imperium save the Emperor himself. Vulkan was a perpetual. To understand the full weight of what it means to be a perpetual, you need to understand what death means in the Warhammer universe. For an ordinary human, death is the end. For a space marine, Death is the culmination of a life spent in service. For a Primarch, death is a tragedy of cosmic proportions. The loss of a being so unique and so powerful that the galaxy itself is diminished by their absence. Ferrus Manus died on Istvan V, and the Iron Hands have never been the same. Sanguinius died on the Vengeful Spirit, and the Blood Angels carry his grief in their very blood. When a Primarch dies, something irreplaceable is lost. But Vulkan cannot die. Not permanently. Not through any conventional means. He can be killed, yes. His body can be destroyed, his flesh burned away, his bones shattered, his very atoms scattered to the winds. But he will come back, always. His cells will regenerate. His flesh will knit. His consciousness will flicker back into existence like an ember that refuses to be extinguished. He has been killed by nuclear fire and returned. He has been killed by decapitation and returned. He has been killed by the vacuum of space and returned. He has been killed in every conceivable way that a being can be killed, and every single time he has returned. This makes Vulkan, yes, in a very real sense, the single most durable being in the Warhammer 40,000 universe outside of the Emperor himself and the entities of the warp. You cannot beat him. You cannot break him. You cannot end him. You can kill him, but all that does is make him angry and give him a few hours or days to regenerate before he comes looking for you again. Consider the implications of this for a moment. Well, imagine you are a warlord or a demon prince or an alien overlord, and you receive intelligence that a being is approaching your territory. A being who cannot be permanently killed. A being who is also the strongest physical combatant among the 20 sons of the Emperor. A being who carries weapons forged specifically to destroy things that should not be destroyable. A being who has survived nuclear bombardment, the torture of a Primarch, the psychic assault of a demon, and the detonation of a greenskin power generator. What do you do with that information? What possible defense can you mount against something that literally cannot stop coming? The answer, for most of the enemies of the Imperium, is nothing. You can slow Vulkan down. You can make him die a few extra times on the way to your throne room. But you cannot stop him. He is, in the most literal sense possible, inevitable. But there is a wrinkle to this seemingly absolute power. A vulnerability, if you can call it that. Repeated deaths, especially traumatic ones, take a toll on Vulkan's mind. Each time he dies and returns, the transition is not clean. There is confusion, disorientation, the existential horror of having been nothing and then being something again. And when the deaths are inflicted deliberately, as they were by Konrad Kurze, the psychological damage accumulates. By the time Vulkan escaped from Kurze's captivity, his mind was shattered. He was technically alive, technically immortal, technically the strongest being on any battlefield he set foot upon. But he was also barely coherent, driven to the edge of madness by an experience that no being, however powerful, was designed to endure. This is the great tragedy and the great triumph of Vulkan's existence. His greatest gift is also his greatest curse. He cannot die, but he can suffer. And the suffering does not end when his body fails. It carries over from death to death, or from resurrection to resurrection. An accumulating weight of pain and confusion and loss that would break any lesser being 100 times over. And yet Vulkan endures. This is what the people of Nocturne taught him. Not strength, not skill, not the art of the forge or the science of the hammer. They taught him to endure, to take whatever the universe throws at you and refuse to stay down, to get up again and again and again, not because you do not feel the pain, but because the things you are fighting for matter more than the things you are fighting against. A perpetual is a rare mutant strain of humanity blessed or cursed with the ability to regenerate from any injury and return from death itself. The Emperor was a perpetual. A handful of other beings throughout history have carried this trait. But among the Primarchs, Only Vulkan inherited this gift from his father. Only Vulkan could be killed, truly killed, as his body reduced to ash and scattered atoms, and then return. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as himself, flesh and blood and bone, whole and complete, ready to fight and die and return again. This was not known to Vulkan during the Great Crusade. He fought and bled and risked his life alongside his brothers without the knowledge that death could not claim him permanently. It was only during the darkest chapter of his existence, in the torture chambers of Konrad Kurz, that this terrible gift was finally revealed, and the circumstances of that revelation are among the most harrowing passages in the entire Horus heresy saga. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the torture came the betrayal, before the pain came the massacre, and before Vulkan could be broken, he first had to be brought to the killing ground of Istvan V. The drop site massacre is one of those events in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that functions almost like a gravitational singularity. Everything that comes before it is pulled inexorably toward it, and everything that comes after is shaped by its terrible gravity. It is the moment where the Horus heresy stopped being a political crisis and became an existential catastrophe. It is the moment where brother turned upon brother in the most literal and devastating way possible. And for Vulkan and his salamanders, it was the moment where everything they had built was burned to ash. The events leading up to Istvan V are complex, but the broad strokes are simple enough. Horus Lupercal, the war master of the Imperium, the emperor's most trusted and beloved son, had been corrupted by the chaos gods and had turned against his father. His initial rebellion had been revealed by the survivors of the frigate Eisenstein, who carried news of the War Master's treachery to Rogel Dawn on Terra. Dawn, acting under the Emperor's authority, dispatched a retribution fleet of 7 full Space Marine legions to the Istvan system to bring Horus to justice. 7 legions, nearly 40,000 Space Marines. It should have been more than enough to crush Horus's rebellion in its cradle, except that 4 of those 7 legions had already secretly pledged themselves to the War Master. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard formed the first wave of the assault. They were the 3 legions known to be loyal, and they were given the task of making the initial drop onto Istvan V to engage Horus's forces, while the second wave, composed of the Word-Bearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion, would follow and crush the traitors between 2 loyalist forces like a hammer and anvil. That was the plan. The reality was a slaughterhouse. Ferrus Manus, our Primarch of the Iron Hands and the senior commander of the loyalist forces, was consumed by a burning desire for vengeance against his former friend Fulgrim, who had tried and failed to sway him to Horus's cause. Ignoring the more cautious counsel of Vulkan and the tactical guile of Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard, Ferrus pushed for an immediate, overwhelming assault on Horus's positions in the Urgol Depression, a massive canyon that Horus had fortified with miles of trenches, bunkers, and anti-aircraft batteries. Vulkan and Corax knew something was wrong. They could sense it. The absence of the traitor fleets from the system's orbit was suspicious. The ease with which the Loyalists had achieved orbital superiority felt like a trap. Both Primarchs urged caution, advocated for waiting until all 7 legions could attack simultaneously. But Ferrus Manus would not be swayed. His rage was too great, his desire for revenge too consuming. And neither Vulkan nor Corax possessed the force of personality to overrule the Iron Hands Primarch when his blood was up. The drop was a bloodbath from the first moment. Thousands of drop pods and stormbirds screamed down through Istvan V's atmosphere and into the prepared killing fields of the Urgal Depression. Horus knew exactly where the Loyalists would land. His troops fell upon them with terrible precision. The Salamanders hit the left flank of the traitor positions. The Iron Hands, with Ferrus Manus and 10 full companies of his elite Morlock Terminators, drove straight for the center. The Raven Guard struck at the right flank. The fighting was savage beyond description. Tens of thousands of Space Marines clashed in the volcanic dust of the Urgol Depression, the air filled with the thunder of bolters and the screaming of chain blades, and the deeper, more terrible sound of energy weapons discharging at point-blank range. Vulkan fought at the head of his legion, the Dawnbringer rising and falling with devastating force, each blow crushing power armor and shattering bones and ending lives that should have been sacred. These were Space Marines he was killing, warriors who had once fought alongside his own sons in the Emperor's name. Brothers. The Loyalists pushed forward, despite the ferocity of the traitors' defense, despite the mines and the kill zones and the overwhelming firepower of Horus's fortified positions. Yes, the sheer fury of the Iron Hand's charge and the relentless pressure of the Salamanders and Raven Guard began to tell. The traitor lines buckled. For a brief shining moment, it seemed as though the Loyalists might actually win. And then the hammer fell. The second wave arrived. The Word Bearers, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion. 4 full legions of Space Marines, nearly 30,000 warriors strong, dropping into the rear of the Loyalist advance. And they opened fire. Not on Horus's forces, on the Loyalists. The betrayal was absolute. The Loyalists, already committed to their assault and stretched thin across the Urgol Depression, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 armies. The traitors they had been fighting from the front, and the traitors who had been their allies and who now poured fire into their unprotected backs. There was no warning, no declaration, no chance to prepare or retreat to defensible positions. One moment, the second wave was descending to reinforce the Loyalist advance. The next moment, they were slaughtering their brothers. The carnage that followed defies easy description. More than 90% of the Loyalist forces deployed to Ishtvan V were killed in the drop site massacre. 90%. Think about that number. Imagine sending 40,000 of the finest warriors in the galaxy into battle and having 36,000 of them die in a single engagement. The Iron Hands were shattered, the Raven Guard were broken, and the Salamanders, Vulkan's beloved sons, the warriors he had forged in the fires of Nocturne and taught to fight with compassion and purpose, were all but annihilated. Ferrus Manus was killed, beheaded by Fulgrim, his former closest friend, in a duel that ended the Iron Hand's Primarch's life and sent shockwaves through the Loyalist forces that would echo for 10,000 years. Corvus Corax survived barely. Pulled from the battlefield by the last remnants of his Raven Guard, critically wounded and consumed by guilt and rage. And Vulkan. What happened to Vulkan? As the massacre reached its climax, as the traitor legions closed in on the surviving Loyalist pockets with overwhelming force, the Iron Warriors' fleet in orbit did something that even by the standards of the Horus heresy was considered extreme. They launched nuclear missiles at the battlefield, tactical nuclear warheads, targeted at the Loyalist positions, designed to eliminate the last pockets of resistance in a single, apocalyptic salvo. The Salamander's Legion, already reduced to a fraction of its original strength, was caught in the nuclear fire. The warheads detonated among the surviving sons of Vulkan, and the warriors who had endured the betrayal of their brothers and the fury of close combat were consumed in atomic flame. For any other being, this would have been the end. The absolute, irrevocable, a final end. But Vulkan was not any other being. The nuclear fire washed over him and should have killed him. It did kill him, in the sense that his body was devastated, his flesh seared, and his organs destroyed, and his consciousness extinguished. But death, for Vulkan, was not permanent. His perpetual nature, unknown to him until this very moment, activated. Somewhere in the atomic wasteland of the Urgol Depression, surrounded by the scorched remains of his sons and the advancing armies of traitors, Vulkan's body began to regenerate. He awoke to find himself surrounded by hundreds of warriors from the Iron Warriors and Night Lords. Broken, disoriented, not yet understanding what had happened to him or how he had survived, Vulkan fought. He fought with his bare hands because his weapons were gone, scattered by the nuclear detonation. He fought with the desperate fury of a being who has nothing left to lose, and who has watched everything he loved destroyed, and who has only the red screaming need for vengeance to keep him moving. It was not enough. Vulkan was the strongest Primarch in the galaxy, but he was alone, weakened, and facing hundreds of enemy marines. He was stabbed, shot, bludgeoned, and finally beaten into unconsciousness. And that is when Conrad Kersey found him. The Night Haunter, the Dark King, the Primarch of the Night Lords, whose hatred of Vulkan had been fermenting since Karatan, and since the Salamander's Primarch had dared to challenge his methods and report his conduct to the War Master. Kers had been waiting for this moment, waiting with the patience of a predator who knows that his prey will eventually stumble. And now, with Vulkan broken and helpless in the ash and rubble of the greatest betrayal in Imperial history, Kersey took his brother prisoner. What followed is among the most harrowing narratives in the entirety of the Horus Heresy saga. But the Torture of Vulkan by Conrad Kers is not a story of physical violence alone, though the physical violence was extreme beyond anything that most human beings could comprehend. It is a story of two fundamentally opposed philosophies locked in a contest of wills that lasted for months. A battle fought not with weapons, but with pain and defiance, and the terrible grinding question of what it means to be human when humanity itself has been stripped away. Kersey did not merely want to hurt Vulkan, and any fool with a blade could cause pain. Kers wanted to break him. He wanted to prove, once and for all, that the compassion and kindness that Vulkan held so dear were illusions. That beneath the surface of the gentle craftsman and the caring father, there was the same capacity for savagery and cruelty that existed in every Primarch. That Vulkan was no different from Kersey himself. That mercy was nothing more than a mask worn by beings too cowardly to admit their true nature. And so the tortures began. Kersey killed Vulkan, not once, not twice, over and over and over again, with a variety and creativity that spoke to the Night Haunter's deeply broken psyche. He cut Vulkan's head off. He ripped out his throat with a fork. He stabbed him through the chest. He tore him limb from limb. He had him eviscerated. He had him shot with hundreds of bolters at close range. He left him in the venting shaft of a starship's engine to be burned alive by the exhaust. He threw him naked into the void of space, where the cold and the vacuum should have killed him in seconds. And every time Vulkan came back, every single time, his body would regenerate, his wounds would close, his flesh would knit back together with a speed and completeness that defied any rational explanation, and he would wake, gasping and disoriented and racked with the phantom pain of a death that should have been permanent, in a new cell, facing a new torture, yet with the hollow echo of Kers's laughter ringing in his ears. It was during these cycles of death and resurrection that Vulkan first began to understand what he was: a perpetual, a being that could not be permanently killed by any conventional means. This knowledge, which might have been a comfort under other circumstances, was instead a source of horror, because it meant that the torture would never end. Kersey could kill him 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and each time Vulkan would return to face whatever new agony the Night Haunter had devised. There was no escape through death, no final rest, no peace. But Kers's tortures were not merely physical. The Night Haunter was a creature of psychological warfare, and he understood that the body, even a Primarch's body, was merely the vessel. The true target was the mind. And so he designed his torments to attack Vulkan's sense of self, his identity, his beliefs. In one particularly cruel experiment, Kers placed Vulkan inside a battle machine, a war engine that he could not control. And then he set the machine loose upon captured Imperial Army soldiers and Raven Guard Marines, helpless prisoners who screamed and begged for mercy as the machine that wore Vulkan's face tore them apart. Vulkan was forced to watch through the machine's eyes as his own hands, his own weapons, killed innocent people. People he would have given his life to protect. People who called out his name as they died, as not knowing that the being killing them was as much a prisoner as they were. Kersey was trying to prove a point. He was trying to show Vulkan that anyone, even the most compassionate and gentle of the Primarchs, could be made into a killer. That free will was an illusion. that the capacity for cruelty existed in every heart, and that the only honest response to a cruel universe was to embrace that cruelty rather than pretend it did not exist. Vulkan refused. In the battle machine, faced with the choice between killing a captured salamander, one of his own sons, or turning the machine's weapons on himself, Vulkan chose self-destruction. He killed himself rather than harm his brother, and then he came back. Again. This pattern repeated itself throughout the months of Vulkan's captivity. Kersey would devise a new torture, a new test, a new attempt to prove that Vulkan's compassion was a lie, and Vulkan would endure it. He would suffer. He would die. Yet he would scream and weep and rage against the darkness that surrounded him. But he would not break. He would not become the monster that Kersey wanted him to be. There is a moment, recorded in the novel Vulkan Lives, that captures the dynamic between these two Primarchs with devastating clarity. After one particularly prolonged sequence of torture and resurrection, Kersey broke down. The Night Haunter, the most feared being in the galaxy, the Primarch whose very name was a weapon of terror, broke down. He wept. He raged. He rammed a fork into Vulkan's heart and screamed his frustration into the echoing chambers of his ship. Because he could not do it. He could not kill his brother. He could not make Vulkan into what he wanted him to be. He could not prove his philosophy right, because the living proof of its failure kept returning from the dead, bruised and bloodied but unbroken, with the same quiet defiance burning in his eyes. Vulkan's survival was not merely physical. It was spiritual. It was philosophical. It was the ultimate repudiation of everything Konrad Kurz believed about the nature of the universe. Kurz believed that fear was the only honest form of governance, that cruelty was the only reality, that kindness was a mask worn by those too weak to face the truth. Vulkan, through his suffering and his refusal to surrender his essential nature, proved him wrong. Eventually, Vulkan escaped. The details of his escape involve a complex sequence of events, including an attempted rescue by Corvus Corax and a team of Raven Guard. A forced confrontation between the two captive Primarchs, orchestrated by Kersey, and the intervention of the mysterious Cabal, a shadowy organization of alien agents who sought to manipulate the outcome of the Horus heresy for their own purposes. A human agent of the Cabal, named John Grammaticus, himself a perpetual, stabbed Vulkan through the heart with a shard of fulgurite, a substance created by a lightning strike from the Emperor's own psychic power. This weapon was supposedly the only thing capable of truly killing a perpetual, and when it pierced Vulkan's heart, it killed both Grammaticus and the Primarch in a massive psychic explosion. But the fulgurite did not kill Vulkan permanently. It did, however, serve a different purpose. Through some mechanism that is not entirely clear, the act of being killed by the fulgurite, combined with the psychic sacrifice of Grammaticus, restored Vulkan's shattered mind. The months of torture, the endless cycle of death and resurrection, had driven Vulkan to the edge of madness. The fulgurite, paradoxically, brought him back. Vulkan's body was recovered by the Primarchs Gilliman, Leon L. Johnson, and Sanguinius, who were at the time operating out of Macragee as part of the secondary Imperium known as Imperium Secundus. They placed his apparently dead body in a stasis capsule crafted by Gilliman himself, with the words, "Unbound Flame," carved into the side. The surviving salamanders, who had made their way to Macragee, were allowed to stand vigil over their Primarch's body, mourning the loss of their gene-father. But Vulkan was not dead, not truly. During the vigil, some of the salamanders thought they heard a heartbeat coming from within the casket. They dismissed it as grief-born hallucination. They were wrong. Eventually, Vulkan's body was transported back to Nocturne, to the sacred volcano of Mount Deathfire, where the Promethean rituals of death and rebirth held their deepest meaning. And there, in the burning heart of the mountain that had been sacred to his people since before the memory of man, Vulkan returned. His resurrection was not a triumphant emergence. It was confused, disoriented, as the awakening of a consciousness that had been shattered and remade and was not yet sure of its own boundaries. Vulkan found himself deep within Mount Deathfire, in the presence of an old man who called himself Deathfire, personified. This figure, who was later revealed to be the Eldar Farseer Eldrad Ulthran in disguise, guided Vulkan to two items that the Primarch had no memory of forging. The first was Urdrakule, the monstrous two-headed warhammer that was his most powerful weapon. Yet the second was the Talisman of 7 Hammers, a device of such extraordinary power and terrible purpose that it would ultimately be installed in the Golden Throne itself. Vulkan emerged from Mount Deathfire changed. The torture had left its marks upon him, not upon his body, which had healed, but upon his soul. He was quieter now, more withdrawn. The easy warmth that had once defined him had been tempered by suffering into something harder and more complicated. But the core of him, the thing that Konrad Kurz had tried so desperately to destroy, was still there. The compassion, the care, the belief that humanity was worth protecting, even at the cost of unimaginable pain. He was met at the steps of the volcano by 3 of his legionaries, Atok Abidemi, Barek Zaitos, and Aigen Gargo. These 3 warriors, the last loyal sons of Vulkan still on Nocturne, were dubbed the Draksward, Vulkan's personal guard for the journey that lay ahead. Because the old man in the mountain had given Vulkan more than weapons, he had given him a purpose, a destination, terror. What followed was an epic journey through the Webway, the ancient network of dimensional corridors built by the Eldar that connected points across the galaxy through a realm outside of normal space. Vulkan used the Talisman of 7 Hammers to open a Webway portal deep beneath Nocturne, and he and his 3 companions descended into a realm of shadows and alien architecture and dangers that would have killed anything less than a Primarch a dozen times over. The journey was not straightforward. Vulkan and his Draksward found themselves in a satellite realm of Komarach, the dark city of the Drukhari, where they were forced to fight their way through the very same breed of alien torturers who had once preyed upon the people of Nocturne. They emerged to find themselves in the company of Shadrach Meduson's fleet, a scattered remnant of the loyalist forces that was still waging a guerrilla war against Horus behind enemy lines. Here, Vulkan encountered something that demonstrated the depth of his compassion and his refusal to allow the dead to be dishonored. The cult of the Gorgon, a faction within Medusan's fleet, claimed to have resurrected Ferrus Manus. When Vulkan met the supposed reborn Ferrus, he found not his brother, but a mechanical puppet with one of Ferrus's metallic arms attached, a mockery, an insult to a fallen Primarch. Vulkan, saddened and angered that his brother's memory would be shamed in such a way, shattered the puppet with his hammer. Continuing through the Webway, Vulkan and his companions reached Kalistar, a human-built section of the interdimensional network that had been abandoned since the Emperor's War within the Webway. Here, they were attacked by demons, and Vulkan was forced into single combat with a great unclean one, a greater demon of Nurgle named Agalbor. In this battle, Vulkan demonstrated the true power of the Talisman of 7 Hammers. Using the device, he was able to not merely banish the demon, but inflict true death upon it, permanently destroying a being that was supposed to be an immortal manifestation of the warp itself. This was an extraordinary feat. It was one that suggested the talisman's power was far greater than even Vulkan himself understood. With the assistance of Eldrad Ulthran, who revealed himself as the old man from Mount Deathfire and opened a new portal that bypassed the sealed entrance to the Imperial dungeon, Vulkan and his warriors finally reached Terra. They emerged before the walls of the Imperial Palace, in the midst of the greatest siege in human history, the Siege of Terra. At the final confrontation between the forces of Horus and the defenders of the Emperor, the battle that would determine the fate of humanity for the next 10,000 years. And Vulkan had arrived just in time to play one of the most crucial roles in the entire conflict. He was reunited with Rogol Dawn, who was visibly relieved to see another Primarch alive and functional. But Vulkan was not given time for reunions. He was led immediately by Custodes to the Golden Throne. As to the Sanctum Imperialis, the most sacred and most heavily guarded chamber in the entire Imperium. And there, seated upon the golden throne, trapped by the necessity of maintaining the psychic seal that kept the breach in the webway from flooding Terra with demons, was the Emperor of Mankind. Imagine that meeting. Try to picture it. Vulkan, who had not seen his father since before the heresy began, or walking into the Sanctum Imperialis and finding the master of mankind chained to his own creation, unable to move, unable to leave, burning with psychic power as he struggled to hold shut a door that should never have been opened. The Emperor who had thrown his Drake into the lava to save Vulkan's life on the slopes of Mount Deathfire. The Emperor who had tested him not with force, but with compassion. The Emperor who had recognized in Vulkan something that none of the other Primarchs possessed in quite the same way, a heart that chose to feel even when feeling brought pain. And now that Emperor was asking his most compassionate son to build a device that could kill every living thing on Terra. The Emperor had been expecting Vulkan. In fact, he revealed that he had been guiding Vulkan's entire journey, from the resurrection on Nocturne, to the voyage through the webway, to the arrival on Terra. But the Talisman of Seven Hammers, which Vulkan had no memory of forging, had been constructed under the Emperor's psychic direction for a very specific purpose. And that purpose was terrible. The Emperor told Vulkan that the talisman was a weapon of unprecedented power, a dead man's switch, a device that, when activated, would consume all of Terra in purifying flame, destroying everything on the planet, every building, every person, every living thing, down to the very bedrock. Its purpose was to serve as the ultimate contingency. If Horus won the siege, if the Emperor fell, if the forces of chaos threatened to take the throne world and the Golden Throne, and all the secrets contained within, the talisman would deny them their prize by annihilating everything. Vulkan was horrified. This was not a weapon. This was an act of cosmic spite, a decision to destroy the very thing you were trying to protect, rather than let the enemy have it. And the Emperor was asking Vulkan, yes, the Primarch who had dedicated his entire existence to protecting humanity, to be the one to press the switch, to be the one to end everything. The Emperor's reasoning was characteristically precise. He told Vulkan that the Primarch had always been the most hesitant to use the weapons he forged, that this reluctance, this deep and abiding unwillingness to cause destruction even when it was necessary, was exactly the quality required in the being who would hold the fate of Terra in his hands. And anyone else might act too quickly, might activate the device in a moment of panic or despair when the situation was not yet truly lost. Vulkan would hold, Vulkan would wait, Vulkan would give every last chance for victory before surrendering to the necessity of annihilation. Vulkan installed the talisman in the Golden Throne and took up his position as its guardian. And there he stayed, through the long, terrible days and nights of the Siege of Terra, as the traitor armies battered at the walls of the Imperial Palace and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. But Vulkan did not merely stand guard. When Magnus the Red, the Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, infiltrated the Imperial dungeon through the webway in an attempt to destroy the Golden Throne and kill the Emperor, Vulkan was dispatched to stop him. He pursued Magnus through the twisted corridors of the webway, and in a brutal, desperate battle, he confronted the Crimson King. Magnus was a being of immense psychic power, a demon Primarch empowered by the dark god Tzeentch. By any rational measure, he should have been more than a match for Vulkan, whose psychic abilities were minimal compared to his physical prowess. But Vulkan had Draculae, and Draculae was a weapon forged by the Emperor's own psychic will, channeled through Vulkan's unconscious mind. When the Primarch of the Salamanders swung that massive, a two-headed hammer at the demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, the blow connected with force, sufficient to shatter the shin of a warlord titan. Magnus's head was ripped from his body, and the Crimson King was banished, screaming back into the warp. Vulkan himself was nearly destroyed in the fight. His body was broken, crumbling apart from the damage Magnus had inflicted. But his perpetual nature saved him once again, and his slowly regenerating form was seen making its way back through the webway portal, Draculae still clutched in his reforming grip. He returned to the throne room just as the final crisis of the siege was reaching its peak. The vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, had lowered its void shields, an obvious trap, but also an opportunity that could not be ignored. The Emperor himself was preparing to lead an assault on the ship to confront Horus directly. Sanguinius, Rogel Dawn, the Constantin Valdor of the Adeptus Custodes, all of them were being assembled for this final desperate gambit. Vulkan wanted to go. He wanted to be there, at his father's side, for the final confrontation with the brother who had betrayed everything they had all fought for. But the Emperor had other plans. Vulkan was ordered to stay, to remain at the Golden Throne, to guard the Talisman of 7 Hammers and, if the worst came to pass, to activate it. Well, the hours that followed were the longest of Vulkan's existence. He stood in the Sanctum Imperialis, alone with Malcador the Sigillite, who was slowly dying upon the Golden Throne in the Emperor's place, and he listened to the sounds of the battle raging above him, the crash of weapons, the screams of the dying, the terrible world-shaking impacts of Titan weapons and orbital bombardments, and closer, closer with every passing hour, the sound of traitor forces approaching the throne room itself. Yet the traitors were pounding on the doors. Vulkan could hear them. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, through the walls, through the very structure of the palace itself. And Malcador, dying, unable to speak, could only watch as the Primarch of the Salamanders stood before the Talisman of 7 Hammers and prepared to make the most terrible decision in the history of the human race. Vulkan began to activate the talisman. He believed all was lost. Yet he believed the Emperor had fallen and Horus had won, and there was nothing left to do but deny the forces of chaos their ultimate prize. His hand was on the switch. The device was powering up. Terra was moments away from annihilation. And then a voice cut through the chaos. A message, broadcast across every channel on Terra. A woman named Acti, speaking with a conviction that pierced through the din of battle and the despair of a dying world. The Emperor still lives. The Emperor is fighting. The Emperor has not fallen. Vulkan hesitated. And in that hesitation, in that moment of pause, born of the same quality the Emperor had identified as essential, the same reluctance to destroy, that had made Vulkan the right choice for this impossible duty. The fate of humanity was preserved. He did not activate the talisman. The Emperor defeated Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, though at a cost so terrible that the Imperium would spend the next 10,000 years paying for it. Sanguinius fell. The Emperor was mortally wounded, but Horus was destroyed, and the traitor forces, robbed of their leader, began to retreat. The siege of Terra was over. When Dawn, Valdor, and the surviving loyalists brought the Emperor's shattered body back to the throne room, Vulkan was there. He watched as his father, the being who had created him, who had tested him on the slopes of Mount Deathfire, who had guided him through the webway and entrusted him with the power to destroy worlds, was placed upon the Golden Throne. The device that had been built to open a door to a brighter future for humanity became, in that moment, a life support machine for a dying god. And then Vulkan did what Vulkan always did. He fought. Leading a furious counterattack from the throne room, Vulkan stormed through the halls of the Imperial Palace and out into the ruined streets beyond, driving the fleeing traitor forces before him with Erdrakule singing its terrible song. That he struck down every enemy he encountered, and in that moment, in the aftermath of the worst day in human history, the Primarch of the Salamanders gave the defenders of Terra something they desperately needed. Hope. In the aftermath of the heresy, Vulkan did not remain with his legion for long. He participated in the Grand Council of Reconstruction, where the surviving loyalist Primarchs debated how to rebuild the shattered Imperium. He initially supported Rogel Dawn's plan for an immediate punitive crusade against the fleeing traitors, driven by a desire for vengeance that was entirely understandable, given everything he had endured. But ultimately, he allowed rationality to override satisfaction. and lent his support to Guilliman's more cautious strategy of consolidation and rebuilding. He was present for the debate over the Codex Astartes, Guilliman's proposed restructuring of the Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable chapters designed to prevent any single commander from ever again wielding the kind of power that had allowed Horus to nearly destroy the Imperium. Vulkan is said to have opposed the Codex, though not out of any desire to retain personal power. His opposition was practical. The Salamanders had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength by the drop site massacre. Breaking them into even smaller units seemed not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous to the chapter's survival. During the Great Scouring, the period of punitive warfare that followed the heresy, Vulkan became enraged by reports of the horrors that the Emperor's children had visited upon the civilian population of Terra during the siege. He personally attempted to hunt down and kill Fabius Bile, the infamous apothecary of the Emperor's children, whose monstrous experiments in flesh crafting had produced horrors that defied description. Whether he succeeded in this hunt is not recorded. What is recorded is that sometime after the Scouring, Vulkan chose to leave the Salamanders. His departure was quiet and deliberate. He told his sons that he would return in the end times, echoing a promise made by other departing Primarchs like Leman Russ of the Space Wolves. But where Russ's departure was dramatic, the Wolf King vanishing into the Eye of Terror with a wild promise to return with the means to heal the Emperor, Vulkan's leaving was something different. It was measured, planned. The departure of a craftsman who has finished one project and knows that the next one is waiting, somewhere out there in the vastness of the galaxy, for him to find it and begin the work. He left behind the Tome of Fire. Think of it not as a single book, but as an entire library, a vast collection of writings and prophecies and cryptic clues, supplemented by scrolls, charts, artistic renderings, well-crafted mechanical devices, and other strange objects whose purpose has never been fully understood. The volumes were rumored to be inked partly in Vulkan's own blood, and the pages supposedly shimmered like captured fire when held up to the light. The Tome of Fire was not merely a document, it was a legacy, yet a father's last gift to his children, a roadmap disguised as a riddle, a test that would determine whether the Salamanders were worthy of the Primarch they worshipped. Within the tome were hidden the clues to the 9 sacred artifacts, not their exact locations, because that would have been too easy, and nothing worth having comes easy on Nocturne. The clues were buried in encrypted passages and allegorical narratives, and symbolic references that required not just intelligence to decipher, but faith and intuition, and the kind of deep understanding of the Promethean philosophy that only a true son of Vulkan could possess. Each successive Forgefather has spent long periods of time studying the tome, inspecting and cataloguing its contents, tinkering with the arrangement of its many components, experimenting with its mechanisms, and seeking to glean from it a measure of enlightenment that his predecessors might have overlooked. The chapter masters and the librarians and the chaplains of the Salamanders have gathered regularly for millennia to pore over the Tome of Fire, searching for the keys that would unlock the location of the remaining artifacts. These gatherings are not academic exercises, they are acts of devotion. Every Salamander who studies the tome does so with the knowledge that the answers they seek could bring about the return of their Primarch, the return of the father they have never met but have never stopped loving, the return of the fire that gave them purpose. For 1,500 years, the galaxy turned without him. The Imperium settled into the grim, grinding stasis that would define the next 10 millennia. The Salamanders rebuilt, slowly and painfully, their numbers never again reaching the strength they had possessed before Ishtvan. They appointed a Forgefather, a captain who renounced his own name and took the name Vulkan, dedicated to the sacred quest of recovering the 9 artifacts. The Tome of Fire was studied and debated and pored over by generation after generation of Salamander's leaders, each one searching for the clues that would lead them to the next relic. 5 of the 9 artifacts were eventually recovered. The Chalice of Fire, a massive forge ship, was found drifting in the void. The Eye of Vulkan, a devastating defense laser, was discovered still mounted on the chalice's hull. Casare's mantle, the spear of Vulkan, and the gauntlet of the forge were recovered through the efforts of successive forge fathers. The remaining four, the engine of woes, the obsidian chariot, the unbound flame, and the song of entropy, remained hidden, their forms and locations locked within the encrypted passages of the Tome of Fire. And then, in the year 544 of the 32nd Millennium, 1500 years after his disappearance, Vulkan returned. The circumstances of his return were characteristically dramatic, but to fully appreciate them, you need to understand just how dire the situation was. The Imperium of the 32nd Millennium was not the Imperium of the Great Crusade. 1500 years of bureaucratic expansion, political infighting, and institutional decay had hollowed out the military strength that had once made humanity the dominant force in the galaxy. The High Lords of Terror, the 12 most powerful individuals in the Imperium, had spent the intervening centuries consolidating their own authority at the expense of military readiness. The Space Marine chapters, reduced in size and number by the implementation of the Codex Astartes, were scattered across the galaxy and frequently engaged in their own local conflicts. So the Imperial Guard was vast, but poorly coordinated, and the institutional memory of how to fight a truly existential threat had been lost to the comfortable assumption that no such threat would ever arise again. They were wrong. A massive green skin invasion, the largest the galaxy had ever seen, erupted across the Imperium under the leadership of a being known only as the Beast. And when we say the largest the galaxy had ever seen, we are including the Greenskin Empire that Horus himself defeated during the Ullanor Crusade, the campaign that earned him the title of War Master. The Beast's forces were larger than that, more organized, more technologically advanced, more terrifyingly intelligent. These were not the crude, mindless green savages that most Imperial citizens associated with the Greenskin threat. The Beast's warriors spoke fluent Imperial Gothic, and they deployed gravitic weapons that could literally tear worlds apart, pulling the surface and core of a planet into orbit to create massive attack moons, artificial space stations the size of small moons that could appear in a star system and reduce its worlds to rubble. They fought with a discipline and tactical awareness that put many Imperial Guard regiments to shame, and they were led by a war boss so massive that Imperial observers initially mistook him for a statue. The Beast stood over 10 meters tall, encased in battle armor of a sophistication that rivaled anything the Mechanicus could produce, and his mere presence on a battlefield generated a psychic field of such intensity that it could drive unprotected humans mad. Terra itself was threatened. An attack moon appeared in orbit above the throne world, and the High Lords of Terra, faced with the very real possibility that the capital of the Imperium might be destroyed, dissolved into panic and political maneuvering. It fell to a space marine named Corland, the last surviving member of the Imperial Fist chapter, and a warrior of extraordinary determination, to organize the defense of humanity against a threat that the bureaucrats who were supposed to be running the Imperium were too paralyzed to face. It was Corland, with the help of Inquisitor Venand, who made the decision that would change the course of the war. The Imperium needed a symbol, a leader, a being whose very presence could inspire the kind of courage and determination that the situation demanded. The Imperium needed a Primarch, and the Inquisition, it turned out, knew where one was. When the Imperial task force arrived at Caldera, they found something that should have been impossible. A massive greenskin invasion, the largest the galaxy had ever seen, had erupted across the Imperium under the leadership of a war boss known only as the Beast. This was not a normal greenskin conflict. The Beast and his forces were smarter, stronger, and more organized than any the Imperium had faced since the Ullanor Crusade. They possessed technology that rivaled or exceeded that of the Imperium. They had developed gravitic weapons that could drag entire worlds apart. They had constructed massive orbital weapons platforms called attack moons that could devastate planetary surfaces from space. And they were winning. The Imperium was in crisis. The Adeptus Astartes were being overwhelmed. The Astra Militarum was suffering catastrophic casualties. Terra itself was threatened, with a massive attack moon hanging in orbit above the throne world like a sword of Damocles. The High Lords of Terra, the bloated bureaucrats who had spent the last 1500 years consolidating their own power at the expense of military preparedness, were paralyzed with indecision and political infighting. It was in this moment of desperation that the Inquisition revealed something they had been keeping secret. They knew where Vulkan was. The Primarch of the Salamanders had been found on the volcanic world of Caldera, a world he had sworn to protect long ago. And he was fighting. When the Imperial task force arrived at Caldera, they found something that should have been impossible. Vulkan, alone, was holding back an entire planetary invasion of greenskins, not a small raiding force, not a scouting party, millions of greenskins pouring across the planet's surface and one Primarch standing in their path, wielding Doom Tremor, the massive thunderhammer he had crafted for this specific purpose. With his regenerative abilities and his impossible strength, Vulkan had been appearing at firefights across the planet, slaughtering thousands of greenskins at a time, dying, regenerating, and appearing at the next engagement to slaughter thousands more. The greenskins, drawn by the challenge he represented, had begun pursuing him across the planet instead of targeting the civilian population, exactly as Vulkan had intended. He was using his own immortality as a weapon, a lure, a shield for the people he had sworn to protect. When the Imperial forces, led by Lord Commander Corland, finally met Vulkan on the surface of Caldera, the Primarch initially refused to leave. He had made a vow to protect Caldera, and he would not abandon that vow, even to save Terra. This was Vulkan distilled to his essence. The galaxy was burning, the Imperium was crumbling, Terra itself was under threat, and Vulkan would not leave a single world undefended, because he had given his word. Eventually, with the help of the Imperial forces, Vulkan was able to destroy the attack moon in Caldera's orbit and save the planet. He then threw himself into the gravitic beam that was draining the planet's surface and core into orbit, enduring forces that would have reduced any other being to atoms, and hurled Doom Tremor into the heart of the gravitic generator, destroying it and saving the world. He died in the process. His body was obliterated by the energy of the generator's destruction. And then, he regenerated. Again. With Caldera saved, Vulkan finally agreed to join the Imperial crusade against the Beast. He crafted and modified Doom Tremor during the journey to Ullanor, the Beast's homeworld, as working in isolation aboard the Imperial Fist's battle barge in a manner that worried his allies. But when the Imperial forces reached Ullanor and the fighting began, Vulkan proved why the Imperium had needed a Primarch. The assault on Ullanor was brutal. The greenskin defenses were unlike anything the Imperial forces had encountered. These were not crude fortifications thrown together by mindless savages. These were sophisticated, heavily armed positions defended by greenskins, who fought with a discipline and tactical awareness that mirrored that of the Space Marines themselves. The Imperium's forces suffered catastrophic casualties, with guard regiments approaching 50% losses, and 1 in every 3 Space Marines falling during the advance. It was Vulkan who turned the tide, personally leading the assault, wielding Doom Tremor with a fury that sent shockwaves through the greenskin lines. The Primarch carved a path through defenses that had stalled entire armies. He pressed forward when others would have faltered, driven by the same relentless determination that had carried him through the fires of Nocturne and the torture chambers of Conrad Kurze and the nightmare of the siege of Terra. At the heart of the Beast's stronghold, Vulkan found his enemy. The Beast was a creature that defied comprehension. A greenskin warboss that stood over 10 meters tall, encased in battle armor of staggering sophistication, and possessed of an intelligence that no greenskin had any right to possess. When the Beast spoke, it was in perfect Imperial Gothic, its words carrying the weight of a being that understood exactly what it was doing and exactly what it intended to achieve. "Humanity is on its knees," the Beast said, "and I will be its end." Vulkan's response was not verbal, it was physical. And he tackled the 10-meter tall warboss, and both of them fell into the Temple Gargant's power generator, a massive energy source that crackled with the strange psychic energy that the greenskins generated through their collective will and belief. Any other being would have been consumed by that energy, destroyed body and soul by the raw power of millions of greenskin minds focused into a single, devastating current. But Vulkan was not any other being. Instead of being consumed by the energy, he became one with it. He absorbed it, he channeled it, and with the primal, savage essence of that impossible power coursing through every atom of his being, he launched one final attack. He slammed Doomtremor into the beast's face with every ounce of his strength, every particle of the energy he had absorbed, and the resulting detonation destroyed the Temple Gargant and everything within it, including Vulkan. The Imperial armies retreated from Olenor, believing the beast dead and the Primarch lost. But the beast, it later became apparent, had somehow survived. The creature that had fought Vulkan was revealed to be one of 6 Primarchs, 6 impossibly powerful war bosses who each commanded their own army. The war continued, and it was only through subsequent campaigns, including the use of Sisters of Silence to create a devastating psychic feedback loop, that the greenskin threat was finally neutralized. As for Vulkan, his fate after the detonation on Olenor is unknown. His body was never recovered, but for a perpetual, that means very little. The current official status of Vulkan in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 is missing and unconfirmed. He is not confirmed dead. He is not confirmed alive. He is simply gone, as he has been gone before. As waiting in whatever quiet corner of the galaxy, a being like Vulkan retreats to when the immediate crisis has passed. And this brings us to the question that has haunted the Salamanders for 10,000 years. Will Vulkan return? The answer, according to every source of prophecy and legend available to the chapter, is yes. But the conditions of that return are specific, and they speak to the nature of the Primarch who set them. Before his disappearance, Ben Vulkan hid 9 sacred artifacts across the galaxy. These were not merely weapons, though many of them were powerful enough to shift the balance of entire wars. They were tests, trials, challenges set by a Primarch who understood, from his very first days on Nocturne, that nothing worth having comes without struggle. Vulkan could have simply left his greatest creations in the vaults of Prometheus, safe and accessible for his sons to use whenever they needed them. Instead, he scattered them across the galaxy and dared his chapter to find them. Why? Because Vulkan knew something that many of his brothers never understood. Power given is power wasted. Power earned is power understood. A warrior who inherits a weapon he did not fight for will never truly comprehend what that weapon represents. He will wield it carelessly, use it thoughtlessly, and one day he will lose it because he never truly valued it in the first place. But a warrior who has bled and suffered and sacrificed to claim his prize will guard it with his life because he knows what it cost him, and he knows what it means. The 9 artifacts of Vulkan are the Chalice of Fire, a massive forged ship capable of producing weapons and war material of extraordinary quality. The Eye of Vulkan, a devastating orbital defense laser mounted on the chalice, whose gaze is described in the Tome of Fire as death itself. Kasara's mantle, a cloak of drake scale that renders its wearer nearly impervious to harm. The Spear of Vulkan, a master-crafted power weapon whose incandescent blade can set even the blessed ceramite of space marine armor ablaze. The Gauntlet of the Forge, a piece of masterwork armor fitted with an integral heavy flamer of devastating power, and 4 others whose very forms and functions have been lost to the passage of millennia: the Engine of Woes, the Obsidian Chariot, the Unbound Flame, and the Song of Entropy. Each name is evocative, laden with the weight of myth and mystery. The Engine of Woes. What is it? A weapon? A vehicle? A device of some terrible purpose, whose very name hints at the suffering it can inflict? No one knows. The Obsidian Chariot. Is it a transport, carrying its rider across the stars? A war machine, armored in volcanic glass and bristling with weapons? An artifact of a more symbolic nature, representing the journey of the soul through the fires of purification? The Tome of Fire offers only riddles and encrypted passages, and the Forge Fathers, who have dedicated their lives to deciphering those riddles, have died one after another, each passing the torch to the next in a chain of sacrifice that stretches back thousands of years. The unbound flame holds particular significance. It was the name inscribed on Vulkan's own casket when his body was placed in stasis by Guilliman, and it is described in the tome as a device both terrible and wondrous. Some scholars have speculated that the unbound flame is connected to the talisman of 7 hammers, the dead man's switch that Vulkan installed in the Golden Throne. Others believe it is something else entirely, a key or a catalyst or a device of resurrection whose purpose will only become clear when it is finally found. And the Song of Entropy, perhaps the most mysterious of all the artifacts. What is a Song of Entropy? And how does entropy sing? What would it sound like if it did? Is it a weapon that accelerates the decay of matter and energy? A device that reverses the fundamental forces of the universe? A literal song encoded in frequencies that only a Primarch's enhanced senses could perceive? The salamanders do not know. They have been searching for 10,000 years, and they still do not know. And yet they keep searching. The current Forge Father, Vulkan Histan, carries 3 of the recovered artifacts into battle: the Spear of Vulkan, Kasare's mantle, and the Gauntlet of the Forge. He is a warrior of extraordinary skill and determination, a salamander who gave up his own name and his own identity to take on the burden of the quest. Every moment of his existence is devoted to the search. He has traveled to alien worlds and the strongholds of traitors. He has ventured into the Imperium itself, searching the nightmare realm of the warp for traces and hints of his lost Primarch. He has faced enemies that would have killed a lesser warrior 100 times over, and he has survived, driven by the unshakable conviction that the quest can be completed, that the artifacts can be found, and that Vulkan will return. The Tome of Fire says yes. The sacred text left by the Primarch to his chapter contains prophecies that speak of a final war, and a last confrontation between humanity and the forces that seek to destroy it, in which Vulkan will return to lead his sons to victory. The condition for this return is clear. When all 9 of the artifacts of Vulkan have been recovered and returned to Nocturne, the Primarch will judge his chapter to be sufficiently tempered, and then he will come back. 5 of the 9 artifacts have been found. Vulkan Histan, the current Forge Father of the Salamanders, carries 3 of them. At the Spear of Vulkan, Kasare's mantle, and the Gauntlet of the Forge, as he continues the search for the remaining 4, the Engine of Woes, the Obsidian Chariot, the Unbound Flame, and the Song of Entropy. Their forms and locations remain locked within the encrypted passages of the Tome of Fire, waiting for the wit and the will and the faith of the Forge Father to unlock them. The search has claimed the lives of every Forge Father who came before Histan. It is a quest that has consumed thousands of years and taken salamanders to the most dangerous corners of the galaxy. And yet the chapter does not begrudge the challenge. They accept it with the same stoic pragmatism that has defined them since the days when their Primarch first taught them to stand and fight, rather than cower and hide. The quest is hard. The quest may be impossible, but the salamanders do not deal in impossibilities. They deal in fire and iron, and the unbreakable conviction that if they keep hammering, if they keep enduring, if they keep believing, the metal will eventually take shape. Since the opening of the Great Rift, the wound in reality that has divided the galaxy in 2, the salamander's search has taken on new urgency. Vulkan Histan has journeyed deep into Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, in search of clues to the remaining artifacts. And for the first time in history, the salamanders are no longer alone in their search. Several of their Ultima founding successor chapters, created during Guilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade, have joined the hunt. The Covenant of Fire, and the Hammers of Nocturne have deployed multiple companies in the search, while other successor chapters have sent smaller forces. The galaxy is darker than it has ever been. The Great Rift has divided the Imperium. Chaos surges across the stars. The Tyrannid hive fleets press inward from the galactic rim. The Necrons stir in their tomb worlds, and somewhere, in the vastness of the void, or in the depths of a volcanic world, or in some corner of reality that mortal minds cannot perceive, the Lord of Drakes waits, and this is why Vulkan matters. Not because he was the strongest, though he was, not because he could not die, though he cannot, not because he forged weapons of unimaginable power, though he did. That Vulkan matters because of what he chose to be. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. In a universe engineered for misery, designed from the ground up to punish hope and reward despair, a being of godlike power chose to be kind. That is not a small thing. That is not a trivial thing. That is, in the context of Warhammer 40,000, nothing short of revolutionary. Every other Primarch, even the good ones, even the ones we admire and root for, and allowed the darkness of the setting to shape them in fundamental ways. Guilliman became a bureaucrat, cold and calculating, governing by logic rather than feeling. The Lion became a paranoid loner, trusting no one, keeping secrets that ate away at the bonds between himself and his brothers. Russ became a blunt instrument, defining himself through violence and aggression and the howl of the wolf. Dawn became a fortress, or walling off his emotions behind a facade of stoic duty that eventually cracked under the weight of the grief it was holding back. Even Sanguinius, beautiful and beloved Sanguinius, carried the curse of his legion like a secret shame, hiding the red thirst and the black rage behind his angelic exterior, consumed by premonitions of his own death. Vulkan chose differently. He looked at the darkness and he said no, not because he did not see it. Not because he was naive or foolish or incapable of understanding the cruelty of the universe he inhabited. He had seen the Dark Eldar tear his people from their homes. He had watched his sons die on the killing fields of Istvan. He had been tortured and killed over and over by his own brother. He knew exactly how dark the darkness was. He had been inside it. He had drowned in it. And he chose, with full knowledge and open eyes, to be a light. In the grim darkness of the far future, and where there is only war, Vulkan chose kindness. In a galaxy that rewards cruelty and punishes compassion, Vulkan chose to care. In a setting where space marines are genetically engineered weapons of mass destruction, designed to feel nothing but the cold satisfaction of a mission completed, Vulkan chose to love. He loved his sons. Not as a general loves his soldiers, with the abstract appreciation of a commander who values their combat effectiveness. He loved them as a father loves his children, where he knew their names, he mourned their deaths, he celebrated their victories and grieved their failures and worked tirelessly and endlessly to make them into the best possible versions of themselves. Not the deadliest, not the most efficient, the best, the most human, the most worthy of the name they carried and the legacy they represented. He loved the people of Nocturne, but the blacksmiths and the farmers and the fishermen who lived in the shadow of the volcanoes and rebuilt their homes every 15 years when the time of trial tore them down. He could have treated them as subjects, as resources, as the raw material from which his legion was forged. Instead, he treated them as family. He lived among them. He worked beside them. He defended them with his life and mourned their deaths and honored their courage in the face of a world that was trying every day to kill them. He loved the ordinary, fragile, painfully mortal human beings who would live and die in the span of an afternoon compared to the millennia of his own existence. On every world the salamanders conquered, Vulkan ordered his warriors to protect civilians, to minimize collateral damage, to remember that the people they were fighting to bring into the Imperium were still people, worthy of dignity and care and the basic respect that every living being deserves. This was not popular. It was not efficient. It was not the way wars were won in the 31st millennium. But it was the right thing to do, and Vulkan did it anyway, because for him, doing the right thing was never a question. It was a statement of identity. It was who he was. And he made that love the foundation of everything his legion stood for. Not strength, though the salamanders are among the strongest. Not firepower, though the salamanders wield fire with a mastery that borders on the sacred. Love, compassion, the quiet, stubborn, unshakable conviction that human lives have value, that suffering matters, that the powerful have a responsibility to protect the weak rather than exploit them. There is a passage in the Promethean Creed, written by Vulkan himself, that captures this philosophy with elegant simplicity. On the anvil of war are the strong-tempered and the weak made to perish. Thus are men's souls tested as metal in the forge's fire. At first glance, this might seem like standard imperial rhetoric, the kind of might makes right philosophy that pervades the culture of the Imperium. But look closer. The metaphor is not of destruction, it is of creation. The anvil does not exist to break metal. The anvil exists to shape it. And the forge fire does not burn to destroy. It burns to purify, to refine, to take something raw and unfinished and transform it into something stronger and more beautiful than it was before. This is Vulkan's vision. War is not the purpose. War is the process. The purpose is what comes after. The world you build when the fighting is done. The community you forge from the survivors. The future you create for the children who will grow up in the peace you have won. Every battle the salamanders fight, they fight with that future in mind. Every blow they strike not just to destroy the enemy, but to create a world where the enemy's cruelty no longer holds dominion. Konrad Kurz tried to beat this out of him. He killed Vulkan over and over and over again, each death more horrible than the last, each resurrection another chance to break. And Vulkan endured it all. He endured the pain and the isolation and the horror and the madness. And he came out the other side with his essential nature intact, battered, changed, scarred in ways that flesh cannot show. But still himself, still Vulkan, still the being who knelt before a stranger on a volcanic mountainside because he recognized that saving a life was worth more than winning a contest. That is what Kersey could never understand. He looked at Vulkan and saw a hypocrite, a being who preached compassion while wielding weapons of mass destruction. He who spoke of mercy while leading armies that burned worlds to cinders. And there was truth in that observation. The salamanders were not saints. They killed, they conquered, they brought entire civilizations to their knees in the name of an imperium that, for all its grand rhetoric about unifying humanity, was in many ways just another empire built on the backs of the conquered. But there is a difference, a real and meaningful difference, and between a warrior who kills because he must, and a warrior who kills because he enjoys it, between a conqueror who grieves for the suffering he causes, and a conqueror who relishes it, between a being who uses violence as a tool toward a greater purpose, and a being who uses purpose as an excuse for violence. Vulkan understood this difference. He lived it. He embodied it. And in doing so, he proved that it is possible to be powerful without being cruel, to be dangerous without being evil, yes, to carry the weight of terrible responsibility without losing the soul that makes that responsibility meaningful. That is strength. Not the strength of muscles and hammers and weapons that can shatter mountains. The strength of character, the strength of conviction, the strength to remain who you are when everything in the universe is trying to make you into something else. We live in a world that often tells us the same lie that Konrad Kurz believed, that kindness is weakness, that caring is naivety, that the only honest response to a cruel world is to be cruel in return. And it would be easy, looking at the state of things, to conclude that the Night Haunter was right, that the universe really is as dark as he believed, and that the only rational response is to embrace that darkness. Vulkan says otherwise. Vulkan, who has seen more darkness than Kersey ever dreamed of, who has died more times than most beings have lived, who has been tortured and broken and remade, and still After everything, after 10,000 years and 1,000,000 deaths, and more suffering than any being should ever have to endure, still chooses to be kind, still chooses to care, still chooses to protect the weak and comfort the suffering, and stand between the darkness and the people who cannot stand against it alone. If you look at the Primarchs of Warhammer 40,000 and ask which one was the most powerful, yet you will get different answers depending on how you define power. Horus had charisma, Magnus had psychic might, Guilliman had organizational genius, the Lion had tactical brilliance, Sanguinius had angelic grace. Each of them was powerful in their own way, and each of them has a legitimate claim to greatness. But if you ask which one was the strongest, not just physically, though that too, which one was the strongest in the sense that matters most? Which one could take the worst the universe had to offer and refuse to let it change what he was? Which one could be tortured and killed and broken and rebuilt and still choose, every single time, to be kind? The answer is Vulkan, the Lord of Drakes, the Hammer of Salvation, the Promethean Fire, the strongest Primarch, the kindest Primarch, the one who cannot die. Somewhere out there, in the vast and terrible darkness of the far future, a fire still burns. It burns in the forges of Nocturne, or where the sons of Vulkan hammer their oaths into flesh and steel. It burns in the hearts of the salamanders, who carry their Primarch's teachings like embers carried through a storm. It burns in the Tome of Fire, where prophecies wait to be fulfilled and artifacts wait to be found. And somewhere, perhaps, it burns in Vulkan himself, waiting, patient as the mountain, enduring as the flame, ready, when the time comes, to return to the suns who have never stopped searching for him, and to the galaxy that has never needed him more. The fire cannot die, and neither can he. If you enjoyed this journey through the fires of Nocturne and the legends of the Lord of Drakes, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on those notifications so you never miss a video. We have so many more stories to tell in this grim darkness of the far future, and I would love nothing more than to tell them to you. And until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and remember the words of the Promethean Creed. Through fire are we reborn.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.